Hey everyone, Caesar from Lightwerkz over here. We're going to be comparing these two bi-LED projectors that have been out on the market for a little bit now. We've got the NHK 4 Plus on the left here and the Morimoto MLED 2.0. It's the latest generation. They've made a few changes and improvements since release, and we're going to compare these in a moment. But we keep getting asked, which projector is the best, and this goes for HID projectors and LED projectors, and that's such a vague question because there's so many other things that go into the recommendation before peak performance is even discussed. So today we're going to be going over a little bit about the differences of these two projectors, what makes one more ideal than the other to use in a certain application, and there's a few questions that you can ask yourself before you even start poking around and looking at Lux comparisons or product reviews from various vendors. One of the first things to really ask yourself is if you need the space. If you need something super compact in terms of overall length, you can tell that the MLED is a lot shorter because it has a removable threaded shaft. So if it's a matter of space, consider the MLED 2 right off the bat, or if you need a threaded shaft. I will say, because the fan is on the bottom, if you're using, let's say, like an AFS bracket or something really compact on the bottom, the NHK is a little bit flatter, and the Morimoto, since the fan is on the bottom, you do maybe sometimes get a little bit more obstruction on the bottom, but those are very specific cases. So if you need a threaded shaft, if you want to keep things easy, you have a large reflector, absolutely go for the MLED. There's no question about it. It's going to make your life a lot easier than worrying about how to mount that projector, whether it's using epoxy or nut and bolt method, 100%, The next thing is color temperature. We're going to fire these up for you in a little bit. And if you like a more modern day OEM LED color, 100% Morimoto. The NHK has a much cooler color temperature. It's also got a ton of color flicker. The NHK will have a step cutoff, and the MLED has more of a slope cutoff. Again, you'll see it in the video in a little bit, but that is another factor of choosing the projector, because a lot of people don't like too much blue, and the NHK, it's not that it's blue, but it's definitely cool. Going over the lenses, if you can tell, you got the AR coating on the MLED 2.0. Bluish purple coating. In the past, it was actually sort of like a brownish goldish color, and that increases efficiency. The NHK 4 Plus does not have any coating at all. Another few things to consider is high beam performance. If you need something for extreme distance, you're using your high beams a lot, you're going to see in a little bit which projector completely hedges out the other one in terms of high beam performance. But for the majority of people, low beam performance is king, and high beams are just additional, it's not something that should be prioritized unless you have a specific condition or, something that you want to achieve. If you haven't noticed yet, the MLED 2.0 driver is right over here on the right-hand side. In theory, if something should fail, it's going to be that driver. And that's much easier to replace because it's a removable component that's located on the exterior of the headlight assembly somewhere in the engine bay. In theory, it's going to be a lot easier to get this projector up and running should there be a failure. On the NHK, you got bare wires. Now, this could be a good thing. You have less things in the engine bay, but if the projector fails, you're taking this bad boy out and you're going to replace the whole thing. So definitely something else to consider. This is a little bit more future-proof, perhaps, again, in theory, but you might not want anything in the engine bay, and you got 4 leads coming out. You got low and high beam, power and ground. And that's going to keep things really simple and clean in the engine bay. Next thing I'm going to mention is the noise that the fans make. You're going to see one of these projectors is extremely loud in comparison to the other. The other is pretty much whisper quiet. We're going to fire up these projectors for you, do some comparisons. Let's do the fan comparison first really quick, because it's pretty obvious and it's right in your face. So MLED, you can hear it loud and clear. It's not super loud, but it's very audible, much louder than the fan noise that you have on a plug and play LED bulb. Of course, it's going to be in a sealed assembly, but it is a hum that you're going to be able to hear outside the vehicle. And the NHK, that's all the noise from the MLED. Can you turn off that MLED really quick? So this is the NHK. The fan is so quiet that the lights in the shop are actually louder than the fan. So big difference there, but you might not care. I mean, it's definitely not a priority. It's just something that we're going to go over. So we're going to do a quick comparison against the two projectors. Lux and peak intensity should not be the only thing that you care about. A lot of people do it. We've done all the comparisons as well, but it's not the most important thing. A lot of the considerations before we make any sort of recommendation for any of our customers is fitment, how is it going to seal, how is it going to align, and those things are prioritized way before we talk about, what has a peak intensity. So up above, I've already told you the MLED has a much more OEM type of color temperature, and some of it's due to the coated lens. Other part, I'm sure, is to the LED chips. You can see it's got a much warmer color temperature. It looks a little bit yellowish in the video. It's actually not quite like that in person, but it's all relative to the NHK. The NHK has that cool white look to it, and it's got a lot of color at the cutoff line. So if you like that color flicker, not that the MLED has none, the NHK and that cool white might be for you. You can see the beam is pretty similar, but you've got that slope cutoff on the MLED and that step cutoff on the NHK projector. And the overall, the hotspot, they're a little bit different in terms of the shapes, but it's really solid on both projectors. The camera's making a few adjustments now. All right, we're gonna walk up and do a few Lux tests. This is low beam mode only. This is the NHK 4 Plus. For the color flicker junkies, that is quite amazing, as you can see. And we're hitting high numbers at this point. It's over 800 lux. We're looking at about 830 lux in the low beam, right at the intensity zone where it should be. And as we move up with this projector, you're going to see that lux fall down a little bit. And that's a good indication that the projector is pretty well optimized in terms of distance, visibility, and strength. Can we see the high beam mode on this one now? So IV plus, the plus stands essentially for an additional performance. It's actually got an LED on the bottom of the assembly, and that increases the performance. You're going to see it's a very tight knit sort of, hotspot zone there. And if we take a look at the lux meter, we're shooting over 1300 lux, which is pretty much unheard of in the HID world. This has a ridiculous high beam performance. And again, if you're doing some long highway driving, long distance highway driving, this is, and you're able to keep your high beams on in the middle of nowhere, this is awesome. We're gonna take a look at the Morimoto MLED now. So NHK 4 Plus, amazing projector, really good intensity. The MLED has been on the same amount of time, so it's a good way to compare these two. Can we bring it down just a little bit? Okay. So let's do right underneath the cutoff. So if we go in the same zone, you can see the intensity is not quite as high as the NHK, but let's put it right under the left side of the cutoff a little bit. And we're hitting about 630 lux, so a little bit less than the NHK. And as you move up with the MLED, you're actually, it stays relatively the same, but we did hit about 700. So the performance is different, it's optimized a little bit differently on the MLED. It's a really solid projector. Let's take a look at it in high beam mode. If you recall, the high beam mode on the NHK projector, it hit about 1300 lux, which is an absolutely ridiculous figure. The high beam on the MLED, it doesn't actually let any more necessarily light out. It just lifts up the shield. The lux, or the intensity, really doesn't change much. Nothing substantial, at least, and you're hitting about 800 lux, which is absolutely completely fine, and it's very high performance, but the NHK completely destroys it in that aspect. So we hope you find this product review useful. Please leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate your support. And let us know if there's anything else you want to see, okay? Thanks again and have a great day.